Okay, guys, welcome to the Orthodox Christian podcast. We had a couple questions come in on the forum, so I wanted to address those. And as a disclaimer, I'm not a priest in the Orthodox Church, so this is just my opinion and best attempt to answer these questions. But if you have further questions, I definitely recommend contacting a local priest in your area. So without further ado, the first question is from someone, and it says, how do you move forward in becoming Orthodox when your spouse is not on the same journey? New to channel, haven't watched everything, so maybe this has been covered already. Much thanks. So this kind of depends on where your spouse is in their journey. So whether they are Christian already, but of a different tradition, or if they are non-Christian. So just in really broad strokes, if they're non-Christian, I'd probably have them interact with something that's more introductory as sort of a gateway to Christianity. And that wouldn't even necessarily need to be to orthodoxy per se. It could just be to the notion that God exists. And along those lines, some things that immediately come to mind for me are a figure like Jordan Peterson, who isn't Christian in the sense of being committed to a particular church, but is very open to Christianity, and I think is really helpful for people that have grown up in more of a secular worldview. And someone else that does come to mind is Tim Keller, who was a Presbyterian pastor serving in New York City and was often engaging with people that weren't Christian. And I find Tim Keller a generally helpful resource. I wouldn't follow him on everything in terms of how he talks about what occurs at the moment Christ is crucified and satisfying God's wrath and that kind of more reformed thinking. But in terms of just engaging with someone who is exploring Christianity for the first time, I think that he is a wonderful resource, and there's probably some resources within the Orthodox Church as well. Maybe something by Frederica Matthews Green could be helpful here, or potentially something by Callistos Ware, like The Orthodox Way, but sometimes those can be a little harder to digest because they are more specific. So if your spouse isn't Christian at all, I'd probably recommend something more introductory, so to speak, before going to the specifically Orthodox content. But if your spouse is Christian and just not Orthodox, then I'd probably try to have some conversations that are addressing their assumptions within the tradition that they're currently part of. And I'm not as familiar with Catholicism as with Protestantism because I grew up within evangelical Protestantism. So if it was myself, well, and it's reminiscent in a way because when I was going to seminary, I was initially studying at an evangelical seminary, and I was really interested in Orthodoxy. And I would say initially I was more interested than my wife, and we had a lot of conversations about the future and which church we wanted to be part of and raise our children within. So I'll give what was helpful for us, and maybe it will be helpful for you. For us, it was good to work through some of the things we just took for granted within an evangelical or Protestant worldview. So one of those things would be the Bible and where it comes from. So it's often the case that within Protestantism, you just take it as a given that we've always had the Bible, and that historically isn't the case. It had to be fought over and decided which books were or were not scriptural. And so that required the mechanism, so to speak, of the church to arbitrate that. It wasn't just something handed down by God at once. It naturally evolved over time, and certain books outcompeted others, so to speak, because they were closely connected to apostles or written by apostles. So I think the question of where scripture comes from is an important one to tackle because it is just in Protestantism often assumed that the Bible's always been there. Another thing that you could talk about is salvation and what that entails. And so I think that there's a pretty commonsensical argument to be made that our salvation depends on our cooperation with God. Salvation is our union with God, and this has to be chosen each and every day. It requires action. Therefore, we are not saved just by believing things mentally. We are saved by instantiating them in our lives, which means that we are saved by participation, or even you might say by works. And that's what the author of St. James says that in his epistle, that it's not just by faith, it's actually by works. And I think that makes sense. And actually the Protestant notion that no works are necessary isn't an accurate reading of a book like Galatians, for instance. So in Galatians, St. Paul rails against the Gentiles who are adopting circumcision and other works of the law, i.e., things that were classically associated with God's people when they were just the Israelites, but were no longer relevant as the Gentiles were included, or maybe a better way to say that is weren't necessary for the Gentiles to adopt as they became Christian, because the new mark of the covenant wasn't circumcision, it was baptism. So that's getting kind of technical, but I mean, you can have these sorts of discussions where you talk about the assumptions around salvation and say, well, in what we do, in how we operate, do we really actually believe that we're just saved by saying a prayer, believing the right things, or do our actions tell us that we are saved by how we act in the world, which direction we're aiming at? And if the latter is the case, which I think there's a strong argument to be made for that, that notion of theology fits really, really well within Orthodoxy, but unfortunately it doesn't fit so well within Protestant Christianity. So other things that you could talk about, I mean, you could go on about this for a long time, and there are a lot of things to compare and contrast, but just the overall direction of the Protestant church in the modern era, do you think that your kids will continue in that? Do you feel like this is a place that is going to preserve the connection between God and the world? Or do you feel like maybe the content is getting watered down, that it's becoming more human-centric rather than focused on God? And you can talk about the modern songs that are being used, the words that are being said in the gatherings. Are these words that are appropriate for mature Christians who want to deepen their faith, or are they more surface level and ultimately unhelpful in our journey towards God, which is very long? It's going to take a long time, God willing, on our journey in this earth. We're going to be alive for quite some time, and we want something that we can really grow into and not tire of and find boring because it's surface level. So obviously there are good songs within Protestantism, and particularly some of the older hymns, but again, from my experience, when I was in evangelicalism and going through theological training, I just found that the songs and so forth were fairly surface level, and I didn't feel confident that two things. One, that I would actually remain a Christian if I stayed within the evangelical church, because I'm convinced that we are living in an increasingly secular time, and if we want to remain Christian, we have to grasp the roots of Christianity, not something that's trying to be relevant to the culture. I think it's important to be intelligible and not to just be totally arcane and strange, but it is important to have a firm connection with historical Christianity. And I found that within the Orthodox Church. And I don't think that you can make the same argument for the Protestant Church, but I think that a lot of Protestants are hungry for that. So the main point there is just cover some of the assumptions, because I think that there's a lot of opportunity to talk about how Orthodoxy may fit what people are already living out in a way that Protestantism doesn't, when you examine the actual theological roots. And then the other thing that's really helpful is just to meet some people that are Orthodox, because if you just are reading books, or and sometimes it's hard because you don't necessarily have Orthodox people close to you, or you don't know them, but if at all possible, if there is a parish, if there is some way to connect with Orthodox people, even online, like over a Zoom conversation or something, it can be really helpful to encourage someone who's nervous about Orthodoxy, because they're able to see These are just normal people who are part of the Orthodox Church. It's not some strange cult. You don't lose your mind. You don't become some strange non-Western person. Hopefully, that's actually people that are fully engaged in their community, and they're other North Americans or whatever nationality you happen to be that are very similar to you, but they're part of the Orthodox Church. So I think that's obviously that question needs to be more specific based on a lot of particulars, but I think that's at least a starting point. So I hope that's helpful. And the next one, let's check this out. Next one is also anonymous and says, "Good day, Max. I just wanted to reach out and say thank you for the new podcast. I'm an inquirer into Orthodoxy. I'm not yet a catechumen as I'm involved in leadership at our local church and don't know the way out yet. It's been great to hear about and from Orthodox people. I really appreciate your interview style, somewhat reminiscent of gospel simplicity. My question isn't necessarily one for a video, but perhaps you have connections to people who could answer it. The nearest Orthodox church for me is over 1,000 kilometers away, and the nearest mission, and by the way, mission means just like a new Orthodox church. So in some Christian settings, that would be called a church plant, but Orthodox mission is just something that's getting going. In any case, the nearest mission that I know of is over 500 kilometers away. What would it take to begin a mission in my town?" So it's a great question. And again, I will do my best to answer it. I don't know like a lot of the specifics about starting a mission per se, and I'm not familiar with how that might be structured within the different jurisdictions of Orthodoxy. But if I was trying to do this, I would probably take a couple steps. So first is, if you are not yet a catechumen, you're just checking things out, probably it's best to start praying Matins and Vespers. And the way that you can do that, because typically Matins and Vespers involve a lot of books, you can go to, if you search Greek Orthodox Archdiocese digital chant stand, so digital chant stand are the main words to search for, but the Greek Archdiocese puts together everything online, and so it's really, really easy to pray Matins, which is morning prayer, or Vespers, which is evening prayer. And so, I mean, you might not be able to do all of that, but if you just get into a routine of daily praying Matins, I would recommend that one. If you're just doing one, if you can do both, wonderful. But if you are thinking about starting a mission, it's really important to start praying in an Orthodox fashion. So I would do that, and then order like an icon of Jesus Christ and maybe the Theotokos, like Mother of God, and set those up and have a candle, and like you could have some incense too, but just create a habit or a rhythm of prayer. I think that would be the most important thing for starters. And then if you're thinking about starting a mission, it might mean that you're interested in becoming a priest. I'm not really sure. But I think, all sorts of people are needed to start a mission. So if you are thinking about being a priest, though, I would consider which group of Orthodox you would want to cooperate with. And in terms of the North American scene, the Antiochians are really good at supporting priests in terms of their education. So if you were wanting to become a priest and start a mission, you could potentially join the Antiochians, and they would potentially pay for your theological education. They do have online theological education, so if you don't want to uproot your family, if you have a family, then that could be a good fit. Otherwise, they do work with the various Orthodox theological seminaries in the States, and it's kind of a lottery system, so you just get luck of the draw and you'll go to one of the three. So I would check that out if you are wanting to pursue the priesthood and like start a mission in your area. And other than that, I'd probably recommend contacting Father Michael Gillis, who I interviewed previously, who is with the Antiochians, and he has regional responsibilities. So I think that he'd be a good guy to talk to, because this, I imagine, would fall within his purview, or at least he would have some connections for you. Or you could also, or you could, talk to both of these guys. There's Father Lawrence Farley, who has planted a number of missions. He's like sent guys out for that and been very good at doing it. So he definitely has a track record. He's with the Orthodox Church of America. So with them, like if you did down the road become a priest or something, I don't know that there's as much funding as with the Antiochians, so that is something to consider. But nevertheless, I think that he'd be a really great resource to connect with. So I also interviewed him. If you search Father Lawrence Farley or Father Michael Gillis online, you will be able to find their contact information. And thanks so much for the questions. That's all I have to say about that one. If you guys do have further questions, I will put a link to the Google form in this video. Also, I will put a link to that digital chant stand. It's a wonderful resource. I know that when I first encountered Orthodoxy, I really wanted to pray in an Orthodox way. And there are various Orthodox prayer books that are helpful, but it's nice to pray the same prayers that are actually going to be said if you go to a church and just get used to how those are structured. So I hope that you all have a peaceful. Take care.